In this video, I'm going to show you my technique for making quick and easy primitive shapes using Corel Painter 12. So one thing I want to mention first is that Corel Painter 12 is not the best tool for making these kind of shapes. You'd be a lot better off doing it with a vector program like Adobe Illustrator, because some things aren't so bad, like the sphere. Obviously, there's a oval selection tool. It's easy to make a sphere. That's no big deal. But this triangle, there is not a triangle shape tool at all. There's only a rectangle and circle. So you'd have to find a workaround then to make a triangle. And there's probably 5 or 6 different ways to make a triangle. But of those 5 or 6 ways, how many steps are going to be involved in that, and how accurate is the triangle going to be? So what I'm going for here is the fewest steps possible that yield the most accuracy. And what I mean by accuracy is these edges line up, there's not a bunch of lumpy sides, and that everything's not all askew. You can draw a cube intentionally in any perspective that you want in this technique. It took me a while to work all this out. I mean, again, this is all stuff that's way easier to do with a vector program, but it can be done with Painter too. So let's take a look at some of these things here one by one. We'll start with the sphere. Now, of course, you'll have to shade this to make it look three-dimensional, and you can watch one of my videos on shading for that. But if you want to make a sphere, easiest way is just to use the oval selection tool, and I'll make a new layer for this sphere. And when you tap with your pen and drag, you'll see that you get this long elliptical shape. Now that's not going to be very helpful because you might want a perfect sphere. So what you have to do is you have to hold Shift. And once you start holding Shift after you've tapped and started dragging, Shift will constrain your sphere to a perfect circle. Now if you include Alt along with Shift while you're tapping and dragging, now I'm holding Alt, you will expand from the center of wherever you started your circle originally. So I'm going to start right here. I'm going to tap and drag, and then I'm going to hold Shift, and then I'm going to hold Alt, and I'm going to keep dragging. I'm not going to let go of Shift or Alt. Okay? And then I'm going to lift my pen up while still holding Shift and Alt, and then I'll let go of Shift and Alt, and then there we go. I've got the perfect circle. You kind of have to do it in that order. You have to tap, drag, hold Shift and Alt together, keep dragging, and then let go of your pen, lift your pen up, and then let go of the keyboard buttons. And then we can easily fill that using the paint bucket. Make sure your paint bucket's set to current color up here at the top, and pick a color, and just tap with your paint bucket, and then do a Control D to deselect that selection that was around your sphere. And there you go, you got a sphere. And if you want to take that and move it around, you can use your arrow tool and move it anywhere you want. If you wanted to resize this, or any of these shapes, it's really easy to use the free transform tool, which is hiding under the arrow tool. You just click and hold, or tap and hold, and select the free transform tool. And then you'll get some different options. If you want to move it, you can move it. If you want to scale it, you'll have to click here to enable the scale mode. If you want to rotate it, you have to click to enable the rotate mode, and so on. So we'll click here to enable the scale mode, and you can see if we drag one of these handles, we get the same options that we had before. So again, we can hold Shift to constrain, or we can hold Shift and Alt to expand from the center. Now one problem here is if we're working with this kind of a sphere, you might get these blurry edges. That'll happen when you make it bigger. So if you want to avoid that, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to make a sphere using this shape tool here. The difference between the two kinds of spheres now is that unfortunately with the shape tool you can't hold Shift and Alt and constrain it, which I think is ridiculous. This should be a feature, but I guess maybe that's something they'll put out in the next version of Painter. So there's no way to constrain it, so unfortunately you're going to have a heck of a time making a perfect circle. However, if you just want to make an elliptical shape, this tool works great. You might by default have these set to some different settings. The way that this shape tool works, if you want to have a stroke, which is a line around a shape, this toggle stroke color has to be enabled. When it's blue, it's on, and when it's not blue, it's off. So you kind of have to watch out for this. These might be set to some weird settings, so when you go to draw your first elliptical shape, it might not work. So make sure that one of these is blue, maybe the stroke color, and pick a black color and turn one off. just leave fill color off. So what stroke and fill do are this. The fill is the color that it fills the shape with, and the stroke is the color that it puts around it. So if I pick a yellow and purple, you can see this is how it works. These shapes then are vector shapes, which vector is something I'll explain in another video, but it's something that makes it easy to change the color of the fill and the stroke on the fly. So what you have to do is you have to have the shape selected that you want to manipulate. So for instance, this is the shape I want to manipulate. You go to the Shapes menu and go to Set Shape Attributes. And now if you wanted to change the stroke color, you could change it to a different color. You can see it changes, and then we can change the fill to a different color. And there you go. So that's a pretty easy way to make some ovals and different spherical shapes. Now, if you decided that maybe you want to make a sphere that doesn't go horizontal or vertical, like maybe you want something like this, but you want to put it at an angle, you just draw it, fill it, deselect, and then we go back to this free transform tool and we'll go to rotate this time. And we'll drag one of these corners, and now we can make a sphere, an elliptical shape that's at an angle. Because I know when you're drawing with it, it only goes tall or only goes long, and it doesn't go at this angle, so you might be kind of confused how to get that shape. You notice when you transform, if you're working at a lower resolution, it can kind of give you these what are called aliased edges here. And if you've ever heard of the term anti-aliasing, that's something that smooths these edges. So you'll have to watch out for this if you don't like these edges. They can happen. I think if you're working at a higher resolution, like 300 dpi, you might not get this as much. But in this video, I'm working at 72, and this can happen when you have these different shapes that you're manipulating. So just watch out for that. Generally, it's better to not scale things up and make them bigger, but reduce them. So if anything, if you know you're going to be resizing something, maybe start and make it a little bigger than you think you're going to keep it in the end. So let's move on to something more complicated, and that is the cube. I have my cube set up here where each side is on an independent layer. That way if I wanted to shade it, it would be really easy to shade. You can see I can shade the top side there, and I can go to the front, add some shading to the front, shade the side. They're all independent from each other. So it's really easy to work with this cube now. Now I can draw a cube at pretty much any angle that I want. It's really easy to do. What this comes down to is just being a really versatile way to make this shape rather than hand drawing it or taking out the line tool and drawing guides and everything. I want this to be as efficient as possible. So similar to the oval selection tool, the rectangular selection can be constrained if you hold Shift or you hold Alt and Shift. However, the rectangular shape tool does not let you constrain, which is very unfortunate, as it would be nice. You can draw cubes with both shapes. However, it's a million times easier to do it with the rectangular shape tool because, again, you have to have perfect alignment on these corners. And if you don't, you're just going to have a heck of a time making a nice looking cube. So you're wondering now, well, how do we make a perfect square shape then if we wanted to, if we can't constrain? Well, unfortunately, the only workaround that I can see to do is to go to New and just make a canvas, let's say 4x4, something that's square, so the same width and height on both sides, and 72 dpi. Just make it kind of smaller, whatever size you think you want it to be. And go to OK, and then now if you are to draw a square or rectangle shape, if you draw within the canvas, you can draw it any size you want. However, if you start from outside the canvas in this gray area and tap and drag to outside the canvas at the bottom right, and then release, it's going to put in a square here, but it's going to confine it within this canvas. And if I set a fill color, you'll be able to see it made a perfect square. One thing to note is that we need to make sure that we're doing rectangles that have rounded edges. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Probably by default, your edges aren't going to be round, they're going to be sharp on your rectangles. So we need to go to Shapes, Set Shape Attributes, and you need to make sure that this option's selected here to round your corners, and you can set your end cap to round too, just to make sure that you don't have any issues with weird pointy edges or anything. And then go to OK, and then now when you draw with your shape tool, you'll have these nice rounded corners. So this is important because if we don't have these round corners, when we go to line our edges up with our cube, they'll have some little sharp things that stick out, and it'll just kind of ruin the cube. It won't look right. So we'll use our rectangle shape tool, draw from outside the canvas to outside the canvas, let go, and we've got our cube here. Now we can select this, make sure the layer is selected here. Do a select all by doing Control A on our keyboard, copy it. We'll go back to our canvas here, and we'll paste it. Now you can see this rectangle came in, still a shape layer, that's good. And now it's on its own layer. We can move it over here. And now we've got a perfectly square shape with nice rounded edges. So the next thing that we do is we duplicate our layer by right-clicking on it and going to Duplicate Layer. Let's name this topmost layer Front. Name the underneath one Back. And we'll take this back layer and we'll move it somewhere. Now, this back represents the back side of the cube. So this is kind of where you're defining the angle of everything. Do you want the cube to go this way? Do you want it to be facing towards you? Do you want to be able to see a lot of one side or not very much of the other? And you kind of have to use your imagination here and envision. You can make a really, really long, rectangle like this. These two cubes are going to connect. We're going to connect the edges, so you're kind of deciding here and plotting it out where you want it to be. We'll do something like this. Now we want to go back to our front layer and duplicate it again by right-clicking on it and going to Duplicate Layer. And now we have another duplicate, and we'll call it Top. Now the next thing that we have to do, this is very important, select the front layer and lock it by clicking this lock here. Go to the back layer, lock it. You'll see that they're locked because of these two icons. Now we won't be able to move them, which is good because it's pretty easy to grab these and manipulate them in ways that you don't want to. So with our top layer selected, we'll go to this white arrow tool, and the white arrow tool will let us change the shape of our shapes that we made here. These are vector shapes, so they can be manipulated differently than lines that you would draw that are not vector lines in Corel Painter. So when we transformed that elliptical shape earlier, the edges got all jagged. Well, this won't happen because this is vector. So this is the main reason why we're drawing these cubes with this tool rather than just with the marquee selection tool. So what we need to do now is, with this white arrow tool selected, we need to drag a selection across these two bottom corners so that they turn red. And when they turn red, that means that they're selected and we can move them. The two corners that aren't red are still going to be pinned down. So if we click and we drag one of these red corners, you can see we can augment the shape now. So we'll drag these two corners to match the other two corners here. So you're going to drag the bottom right corner of your face to the top right corner of your back. And just get it pretty close. And if you need to, you can zoom in, hit tab on my keyboard so that I can see both corners. And back to the white arrow tool. And then I'm going to use up and down and left and right on my keyboard just to kind of nudge these corners. And you want to get it pretty spot on. Look at both corners. I can see this one over here on the left is off, so I need to go and scoot it around a little more. I think that looks right now. Zoom out, make sure it looks good. Now it's really easy to get the bottom, so all we have to do is duplicate the top. Call one of them bottom, and take our layer adjuster tool and just select it. That'll make it so that we can move this bottom layer here, and then just use our keyboard to move it down. Whoops. You have to select the layer, tap here on the screen. Sometimes that happens if you hit down with a layer selected, then you start moving your layers. So watch out for that. So tap here just anywhere on your canvas, and then hit down with your keyboard. Now you'll see it moves kind of slow, but if you hold shift, it'll move quite a bit faster. So again, try to get it pretty lined up. If you have to zoom in, just zoom in and see and make sure that it's all aligned perfectly. That looks good. There you go, we've got a cube. So you have to do it in that order. The reason why it works that way is because when you duplicate this front and make it into a top, two of the corners are already aligned, so all you have to do is grab the other two corners and align them, and everything comes out perfectly in proportion, and it looks right. If you try to do this with this rectangular selection tool and maybe use distort or something, one of the transform features, you're going to have a heck of a time getting these corner points lined up, and then you're also going to get this jagged edge stuff. So this is really the best way to make a cube, and it's the fewest steps and it's the most efficient. Now if we want to add a fill to this, what we can do is we can click on the top layer. Actually, we need to unlock these first, I'm sorry. We'll unlock the layers, and we'll click on the top layer, hold down shift on the keyboard, select the back layer, and then we will go to shapes, set shape attributes, and we will make a fill, and we will click on the fill color. Let's make that black. There you go. And we've got a cube. Now if we want to do some shading on this, we need to rasterize these layers so that we can begin to add some shading to them. And what rasterizing does is it makes it so that this layer that was a vector is not a vector anymore, and it'd be great if we could keep it as a vector, but unfortunately if you want to do shading and airbrushing on it, it can't be a vector anymore. So what we'll do is we will right click on the top layer, convert to default layer. We'll have to do that for each of these. You'll see the icon changes. When it's a vector, it kind of has these different black and gray areas in it, and when it's not a vector, it just looks like that. So do that for each of these layers, and then they will all be rasterized, and we'll be able to shade them. So we'll go back to the top layer, turn on preserve transparency. We can pick a color. Doesn't even have to be the final color, but you can just, if you want to make it easier just to distinguish between what's what, you can just make each one of these a different color. And do one for the front. And we need to do the back. Okay. Front needs to be in the front of the bottom. There we go. Everything looks better now. We can make the bottom the same color as the back. And there you go. Now we've got something that looks like a cube. And we can fuse together the bottom and the back layer by holding shift and selecting both, and then doing a Control E. And now we can just call this side. So now these two layers are one. If I show you, I can move it. No, you don't want to see that much of it, but there you go. So now we can go ahead and shade this if we wanted to actually make it like my example here. We'll go to top. And there you go. You've got your cube. And you can group it together by selecting all of the layers, holding shift, and then you can do a Control G to group it, and we can call it Cube 2 or whatever you want to call it. Now if you want to scale it, you'll have to finish shading it first, because unfortunately you can't scale a group in Painter. You can in Photoshop but not in Painter. So what you have to do is you have to flatten your whole cube here. So easiest way to do that is to collapse the group by clicking this triangle, and then do Control E, and that'll flatten everything to a new layer. Now if you want to, you can use free transform to scale this. And there you go. And I would recommend not scaling it bigger, but just make sure that you scale it smaller. And you got a cube. And if you wanted to duplicate the cubes, you could, and you could hold Alt on your keyboard while dragging with the layer adjuster tool, and that'll make duplicates. Or you could just duplicate it here by right clicking on it and make a duplicate, and then you can see that you can pretty easily make a bunch of stuff that's in perspective. Now we'll take a look at how to make a triangle. As I mentioned earlier, some of these things are going to be easier to make with a vector program. In Adobe Illustrator, it would take half a second to make a triangle, but in Painter, since there's no polygon tool or triangle tool, it's going to take a little bit of a workaround to do. So what we'll do is we'll start with a square shape tool here, and we'll use that same trick from earlier that we used to make our perfect square shape by creating a canvas that was perfectly square, and then drawing our rectangle from outside of the canvas in, like so. And then doing select all by doing Control A on the keyboard, copying, going back to our canvas and pasting so that we have a perfect square shape here. And we can move it down. Now what we want to do is we want to just remove one of these corners. So what we can do is we can go under the shape selection tool and hold down till we get this extra menu, and we'll go to this pen tool with the minus next to it. And you can just click on one of these points here to remove it. There you go, you've got a triangle. At this point, you can kind of do a few different things to make this the kind of triangle you want. You can go back to the white arrow tool and select just this top point, and you can move it around. Or if you want a perfect triangle, and you could go ahead and just fill it. Or we'll go to shapes, set shape attributes, give it a black fill here, and then we can go ahead and rotate it using free transform, rotate, and if you hold shift on your keyboard, it will constrain it to one of these certain degrees, and it'll constrain it to just a diamond shape, or basically it'll just make your triangle upright. And you click OK to commit. Now unfortunately what this does is it does rotate it, but then it automatically rasterizes it, and you'll see that the edges might get a little jagged. But it's not the end of the world. You can go through and scale it down if you wanted to, and that would probably help a little bit to make it less jagged. If you want to, you could also go to free transform and distort, and that'll let you play around with this quite a bit. You can even get some really crazy curve shapes here. You can do a lot of interesting things to this triangle. We'll move on to the cone. Let's hide some of our examples here. Here's our cone, and we've got the base. This could be a hole in the cone, or it could be a base, one or the other, depending on how you want to do it. If you wanted it to look more like a cone that's facing towards you, that doesn't have a hole in the bottom, you could of course make them the same color, and there you go. So making this cone is quite a bit like making the triangle. What we need to do is we need to use the same trick that we were using before to get our square shape. I'll just copy the one that I have here, and we'll paste, and then we will use the white arrow menu here to get to this remove corner point tool, delete a corner point, and then next we'll use the free transform tool to rotate. We'll have to enable rotate here, and again I'll hold shift to constrain it so that it ends up being an upright triangle. We'll click the check mark to commit. We'll do one more free transform as a scale, just to drag the top up, and we'll commit to that change, and there you go, we've got another triangle. And it does those jagged lines again. It's not ideal, but you know, it's what you get in Painter, and we can always fix that stuff later. And then the next thing you need to do is make a new layer. This will be for the base. We'll use the oval selection tool. You want to click on the very corner here of your triangle and then drag to the opposite corner and then go straight down and then decide how wide you want your base to be. Doesn't have to be perfect, but get something pretty close. Then you can pick a color and you can fill it with that and do Control D to deselect, and you can use your layer selector tool and then use the arrows on your keyboard to nudge this into place. Now if you ended up doing it too big like I did here, all you need to do is just scale using the transform menu, and there you go, you've got your base. And as far as this cone part, we can just fill that in. We can just take the paint bucket and black, fill it in, turn on preserve transparency, and choose a color, fill it in, and there you go, we've got a cone. Now, as I mentioned, you might have to clean up some of these edges. We could do that by turning off preserve transparency, and you could use a blur brush to kind of soften it a little bit. That would help. That might be nice to do anyways, just to kind of give your work a more painterly look. Or if you wanted to use the eraser, you could do that. You could use the straight line stroke mode, tap, and then drag a line and try your best to get all of that junk. And you can see I got most of it there. And there's a little bit of stuff on the inside that you could clean up. This stuff's probably a little easier to do with the blur. That's the freehand stroke mode, of course. But honestly, this kind of little stuff isn't really going to show up. And once you do shading over it, it'll go away. So we won't worry too much about that. I'm going to delete these examples here and hide my cone. We'll do a cylinder. Cylinder's a little bit easier than a cone. It's some of the same steps. We will start by creating a new layer for one of our cylinder openings or sides, and we'll use the oval selection tool to draw an oval shape, like so. We'll fill it with a color, do a Control D to deselect. We'll right click on the layer and duplicate the layer. Use the layer adjuster tool, or select it, and then use the up and down keys on your keyboard while holding shift to move your cylinder bottom straight down. Now this will define how long your cylinder is. We'll go to something like right around here. Let's label these. Let's call this bottom and top. And that way we'll know what's what. We'll move the top above the bottom. We'll create a new layer. We'll call it middle. So this will be the center connecting the two. Zoom in so you can see this pretty well here. We'll switch to the rectangular selection tool, and you want to start from the very corner here of your top cylinder top and drag to the bottom point on the opposite side and get something like that. So you're basically just drawing a square. So you want to be pretty centered with the elliptical shape, and then you want to be as near the edge as possible. That way these edges all line up perfectly. If you don't get it perfect, that's okay, because we can adjust it. So we'll fill it, and then we'll do a Control D to deselect. I got mine pretty good, but I can see here on the side, definitely does not line up. The other side, it's pretty spot on. So we'll do a free transform again. Oops, I have it set to move. Fix that. You have to watch out for that. If you want to do scale, you have to select scale. It's kind of frustrating that it resets, but that's what it does. And then you have to scale it just a little bit. Step back and look, see if it looks good. If you find you're fighting with it to get it perfect, if you just want to shave off a little bit of an edge, take your rectangular selection tool and just draw in a selection there and then hit delete, or do a clear, just erase it however you have to. I think I have my keyboard shortcut set to where delete clears, and if you want to do that, you can do that in the edit menu under preferences and customize keys, because by default clear is not set to delete, and it should be, because it's really helpful just to be able to delete stuff. So that's what I did there. Go back and show you again. Did the rectangular selection tool, drew a selection over that little edge I want to cut off, and then just hit delete. There you go. Now we got a nice looking cylindrical shape. Now we can color the top by turning on preserve transparency, and pick a top color, pick a middle color, and the bottom can be the same color as the middle, or if you want to make a hole in the bottom or in one of the sides, just move the bottom above the middle, and there you go. You could then switch the top, and you've got an upside down can or something. And of course, if you wanted to manipulate this shape, you would have to then collapse all the layers. So I'm going to group them together by holding shift and clicking on top to the bottom, and do Control G to group them. Then I'm going to do a Control E to merge them. And of course you would have wanted to have done your shading first if you were going to do any shading, because once they're merged you're not going to have these independent layers. And then we'll do a free transform and scale, and then you can see that I can make any kind of cylindrical type shape that I want really easily. And you know, if you wanted to rotate it or something, then you can too, and there you go. You've got some kind of pipe thing. And as I mentioned before, you can duplicate. So if you wanted to make some more complex thing, it's pretty easy to do. Or if you wanted to make like some sort of stack or something, that's pretty easy to do also. Again, group these and merge them, and then I'm holding Alt on my keyboard to do these duplications here by dragging, and I'm going to actually, let's scale this down a little bit. That's better. And you can see I can make some different kinds of more complex shapes, like a cake, or you know, this could be a lot of different things. A hat, you know. So you can get some really good results that look like 3D models that aren't actually 3D. The last thing that we'll look at is the torus. A torus is a ring shape, like a donut. It's essentially a cylinder with one end connected to the other, and they're pretty easy to make. There's two different ways to make them. It'll give you different results. We'll look at the first way, which is the fastest way. You can take the oval shape tool here and simply just draw an oval. And if you go to shapes, set shape attributes, then you can increase the width of the stroke, and you want there to be no fill, just a stroke, and then there you go, you've got a torus. Now if you find that this width setting kind of maxes out, you could try making a smaller torus in diameter when you draw it, you know, do it more like this, and then go to shapes, set shape attributes, and increase the width that way. Or if you find you want to make a torus that's not perfectly straight on, there's another way to do it. You can use the oval selection tool, make a new layer, and then fill it with a color. Let's just use black. We want to duplicate that layer, and then make this duplicate layer white by filling it with white. Deselect the selection with Control D, Then let's free transform this white oval here. I'm holding down Shift and Alt like we did before to scale it down, and then we can drag from one of these sides if we want and hold Shift and Alt to scale it on this axis. We can get something like this, commit to the change, and then if we want we can use our arrow keys to move it up or down to kind of make it look like this end of the torus, the lower end, is closer in perspective than the back end is, and you might want to do this in some different cases here. So you can really fine-tune that however you want, and then when you're ready to cut out this shape from the middle of the shape behind it, what you can do is you can right-click on the hole, the white shape, do Select Layer Content, and then go to the layer underneath it that you want to punch the shape out of, and make sure that Preserve Transparency is not on, otherwise it's not going to work. And then you'll want to hit Delete or choose Clear from the Edit menu. And if you turn off the visibility of the layer above and deselect with Control D on your keyboard, you'll see that this hole was punched in the shape, and now it's just a ring. So it's two different ways you can get rings. Of course you can delete this extra layer if you want, but and then to make them look three-dimensional you'll have to do some shading. You can watch one of my videos on how to shade primitive shapes to get a feel for how to do that. But anyways, I hope this helps you when you're creating three-dimensional shapes. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.